Welcome to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin and Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. This is the list of Russia under the communist regime, and we continue today a series of lectures on the Russian Civil War. In the previous video, I talked about the Red Terror, that the epicenter of which was in the fall of 1918, at the very end of what is known as World War I. But in terms of Russian context, it was a very bad year for the Bolsheviks when the army of the Constituent Assembly was pushing the Bolsheviks towards Moscow. The last major battle was near Nizhny Novgorod on the Volga, and that's where we ended the previous discussion. Today, I'd like to talk about the next important stage of the Russian Civil War, one of the ones that mostly well known, and that is called the Whites. Who were the Whites? The Whites were the Tsarist officers who basically organized the volunteer army, and it was pretty much inactive. It was beaten in 1918, and as I mentioned before, the first major stage of the Russian Civil War was in 1918 between the government of the Bolsheviks, the communist government in Moscow, and the government of the Constituent Assembly led by socialist revolutionaries, the socialist government on the Volga in the Volga, Siberia, Urals area. Now, when the World War I ended in November, it dramatically changed the situation, the political situation, absolutely dramatically changed it. Because up until this point, as I mentioned in the previous video, the Bolsheviks were afraid for their lives. There was no longer any need for the Germans to keep them in power, and they would much rather have replaced them with a subservient regime like they did in Ukraine, where they established a puppet regime of Skoropadsky. So they were very afraid that things were going, if the Germans were holding out in the Western Front, and if they could do what they were planning to do, they probably would have overthrown the Bolshevik regime and installed a new puppet regime there. However, Bolsheviks were extremely lucky in that on the November 11th, World War I ended, and Germany was out of the game, which meant in practice that the entire Ukraine occupied by the German forces and their puppet regime of Skoropadsky collapsed. And the Bolsheviks now could move into areas that were under, from their point of view, under the kulaks. In other words, rich area of Ukraine with plenty of crops and food supplies, and they needed those badly. So they just were extraordinarily lucky. Now they could plunder Ukraine for the benefit of their regime, starving regime in central Russia. Moreover, it eliminated a threat of German occupation, and it opened up new possibilities for the Bolsheviks to survive and to expand, and their horizons were into establishing a worldwide proletarian revolution. It's also important to notice, speaking about the Bolsheviks, is that it would be simplistic to think that they didn't change. If Trotsky was told in 1918, a year earlier, in 1917, that a year later he would be building a Red Army, and that his regime would depend on Red Terror and mass executions, he would probably not believe it. He was still a kind of considered himself a leftist, sort of socialist, radical revolutionary, defending the working class. And those that argue that the Bolsheviks were doing all this just because that was prescribed by their Marxist ideology, I think also misunderstand the situation. The situation is that people destroy others when they're afraid. Just like a dog that is afraid is going to bark and bite. And so my explanation of the Red Terror is that they were scared to lose, and they were fighting for their life because they were losing on all fronts, and their economic policy did not make any sense, and they were afraid to admit it and do something else. So they're just doubling down on the same kind of despotic, robbery of the peasants, forcing the workers to work for no wages, etc., etc. So this was the political situation at the end of 1919. And now we come to the year of the whites, which is extraordinary successes and failures, ups and downs of the white movements. Now, one more time, white movements were led by the volunteer officers, those that were just basically trying to rebuild Russia from scratch. And there were two important ones. There was Admiral Kolchak in the east, and I will refer to it as the whites of the east, and there was General Denikin in the south. The problem with this was that when they show on the map, how the Bolshevik regime was surrounded, it's not exactly accurate because they were out of sync with each other. The Kolchak offensive was at its apogee, which was the highest point, in March 1919, for the reasons I'll explain later today. But by July, just a few months later, it collapsed. And they were in irreversible retreat. And in July 1919, 1919, the Bolsheviks were already in the Urals and pursuing Kolchak's forces into Siberia until its final collapse and capitulation. Now, whereas Denikin's forces, who posed probably the most serious threat, military threat to the communist regime in Moscow, they had no hope of doing anything at all in March 1919, and it was then that General Denikin proclaimed himself to be subordinate to Admiral Kolchak. But then it so happened by June 1919, Denikin started his historic offensive that brought him to the doorsteps of Moscow by October 1919. And by that time, Kolchak were already beaten, and there were just no way to coordinate this. Now, why is this? Why is it that the white movement was so discoordinated and had its different stages of a movement? A very simple explanation that I would go into much deeper detail is that the white movement did very well and did extraordinarily well at the time when they were moving into the areas that had had enough of the Bolshevik atrocities and Bolshevik terror. When they moved into areas that were already in rebellion against the Bolsheviks, they were surprised at their own successes. However, the same was true in the opposite direction. After a few months of the white regime, especially in the East, especially the kind of a free-for-all anarchy that prevailed in the Kolchak areas, the local population began to have second thoughts as to whether this is such a good idea to support the whites, and it was beginning to collapse, and more troops had to be diverted from the front to suppress local rebellions and local movements, especially in the south. It was with Nestor Makhno movement. So this is a kind of a basic rule, which I will go into a much better detail. But now let's just move on to the what I call the tide of the whites in the East. So, beginning of the tide of the East, that's Admiral Kolchak, is December 1918. In December 1918, this is of course November is the end of World War I, and also in November, it is Admiral Kolchak who staged a coup d'etat in Omsk. Siberian town, a coup d'etat against his government. His government was a so-called all-Russian government of the Constituent Assembly, where Admiral Kolchak was a war minister. So it was a multi-party sort of center-right, center meaning socialists, socialist revolutionaries and right Mensheviks, and right meaning the monarchist parties, and they were all united in one government, and that was called all-Russian government to fight the Bolsheviks. Now, it is against this government that Kolchak staged a coup d'etat, a classical right-wing coup d'etat, where the SRs were seized in their homes and executed. And he established a clear-cut military dictatorship of the army the army officers, and he had great backing of the British, especially the British. In fact, too much so. This was one of the reasons why many later turned against Kolchak, even among the officers, because they didn't want to serve a regime that was subservient to the British. They still wanted Great Russia and not some kind of a semi-colony of Britain, a subservient regime that was totally dependent on the British. In any case, the British did provide enormous amounts of money and some ammunition, but basically that didn't make any difference in Kolchak. His forces were like this. He had 40,000 Siberian army. He had 20,000, which was called the People's Army, which was a socialist revolutionary army, mainly of workers in the Volga area. And then there were 30,000 Czechoslovaks, and I explained who they were. They were sort of an independent allied force, and they totally depended on the political decisions of the British and the French, because the fate of Czechoslovakia was going to be decided by the Allies. And even though they were much, much more closer affiliated with the socialist revolutionaries and the all-Russian government, of the Constituent Assembly, they could not afford to do a separate course. So they were kind of reluctantly obeying Kolchak regime with their true sympathies to the democracy and to the socialists in power that had been overthrown. So this makes 80,000 troops, and this was not enough in the assessment of the Allied observers who were all there. This is a remarkable period. We have American consul, British consul, all of them are in Siberia sending their fantastic reports. And for us, it is a great source of what was really going on in the Urals and Siberia at this time. So their assessment was that they had no chance whatsoever to launch a military offensive. And yet, in March 1919, what I call the White Tide, the Kolchak forces staged a remarkable breakthrough in the city of Perm, which is east of Yekaterinburg on the road to the Volga region. And overrun Bolshevik forces, took 20,000 prisoners of war, took enormous amounts of ammunition, of all kinds of supplies, 40, I think, trains loaded with all kinds of goods. It was an extraordinary success, which launched him on the offensive, which peaked in May, by which time they were closing in on the Bolsheviks, approaching the Volga, and the Bolsheviks again were in panic that if things go the way they were going, soon they would be in Nizhny Novgorod, and then one would have to prepare for the defense of Moscow. So the biggest question here is, why did Kolchak do so well? The reasons are not with Kolchak. The reasons are with the Bolshevik policies in the areas where they were moving into. And just to make a short story, I will read you a resolution of workers, which was passed in December 1918 in Perm province and at the Ural plant. And it would pretty much tell us what the workers' sympathies were in the so-called proletarian regime of the communists that claimed to rule in their name. Okay, so here it is. Perm province, December 1918, on the eve of Kolchak's advance. About food supply. We, the hungry workers, demand an increase in our food rations of bread, and not the kind of bread that even pigs wouldn't eat, but bread made of flour, as well as all other additional food products, such as meat, cereal, potatoes, and other foods. As of 6 December 1918, we demand an increase of food rations. As if they are not going to be increased, we will be compelled to stop work. 2. We demand that leather jackets and caps be immediately taken from the commissars and be used to manufacture shoes. We demand the speediest possible acquisition of felt boots and warm clothes and their distribution to citizens. We demand that commissars and employees of Soviet institutions receive the same food rations as workers, and there would be no privileges for the bureaucrats. We demand that threats with pistols against workers at the meetings be abolished, and arrests be abolished too, and there would be freedom of speech and assembly, so that there will be true power of the workers and peasants and workers' deputies, and not that of the Cheka. We demand the abolition to the taking away of food and flour from the hungry workers, their wives and children, and the abolition to impose fines on those peasants who sell foodstuffs, and who deliver food to cities, and who let workers stay overnight in the countryside. And we demand freedom to bring up 1.5 poods of food into the city. Number 7, we demand that the province Department of Food Supply, if it cannot provide population with food, pass over the authority to the Mutaviliha Plant Department of Food so that they could work independently. We demand the convocation of an all-plant general meeting to take place on 5th of December, as soon as with the participation of the Regional Department of Food Supply. We demand that all appointees be removed from their positions and elected people would take their place. We demand pay for the time we spent at the meetings. We demand abolition of fines for workers. We demand abolition of death penalty without trial and investigation. There must be justice. We demand that the commissars be for the people and not the people for the commissars. Uh, we have a witness to what happened to these workers, and that is the testimony of the British consul. And the British came with the whites into Perm, and this is what the Viceroy Consul Palmer, reported to the Department of State. Judging from the goods seen at the station, it would appear that the Bolsheviks had practically looted the city and packed their plunder in these 5,000 rail cars with the intention of evacuating it. But their plan was frustrated by the rapid movement of Cossacks, who took the city and cut their retreat. And also, here is the report of the British consul in Yekaterinburg, who reported on March 3 to London, March 3, 1919, quote, "Laborers opposing the Bolsheviks are treated with the same manner as the peasants. 100 laborers were shot at the Motaviliha plant near Perm in December 1918 for protesting against Bolshevik conduct." So here we have authentic documents, which you can find in my book, Behind the Frontlines of the Civil War, Political Parties and Social Movement in Russia, page 94. These are authentic documents by the British consul and by the American consuls as to what was the fate of the workers and peasants who protested the Bolshevik rule. That explains that attitude, this kind of dictatorial, draconian measures, this sheer dictatorship over the workers by the communist regime, that explains that when the whites moved in, they were greeted at first as liberators. Again, that was as liberators from the Cheka terror, from the waving on pistols and requisitions of grain and all sorts of things that we heard in the workers' resolution. Passed in this plan. We also know a little bit more about the Red Terror. It was not just against the aristocracy. It was not just against the bourgeoisie. It was actually against the workers. Yes, at least here we know now, 100 workers, for passing a resolution against the Bolsheviks at their meeting, were executed in Perm. And that what is explained the movement of the whites of Admiral Kolchak into the Urals and Volga area in 1919. I shall stop at that, and then we shall continue the series of lectures on the Russian Civil War. Dr. Brovkin, sign up for my channel, and see you next time. Bye-bye.